A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the arts and culture app. Created by Bloomberg Philanthropies, Bloomberg Connects lets you access museums, galleries and cultural spaces around the world on demand. Download the app to access digital guides and explore a variety of content. Hello, I'm Ben Luke and welcome to a new series of A Brush With, the podcast from the Art newspaper in which I talk to artists about their influences, from writers to musicians, filmmakers and of course other artists, and the cultural experiences that have shaped their lives and work. And in this episode, it's a brush with Michael Craig Martin, an artist who over the past 6 decades has created an instantly recognisable body of work in which everyday objects are depicted simply in black outlines and often filled and surrounded by saturated bright colour. The objects can be alone, in close-up fragments or in complex combinations, and are captured in everything from small prints to room-scale installations. Born out of conceptual art in the 1970s, they ally the vibrant and consumerist associations of pop art to the tough, matter-of-fact sensibility of minimalism. Intending at first to eschew style, Michael came to realise that his technique is inimitably his, and the work's meaning has also shifted over the decades, gaining new and poetic significance. As he's honed his language, Michael has pushed it into new territory, incorporating portraiture and homage to historic art into his endless project to explore representation. 50 years on from his first drawing, this remains his core concern. What is it to represent something, to make an image of it? How does image making work? What does it allow you to do? And what happens when a viewer encounters what you've done? The result is a world of sensation and visual and experiential pleasure that might seem unexpected given the nature of the items he depicts. This knack of making the humdrum compelling, even lending it a sensory power and emotional resonance, is why Michael has remained an enduringly significant figure in contemporary art. Michael was born in Dublin in 1941, but his family moved soon afterwards to London and then to the United States. He grew up in Washington, D.C. and was educated at Fordham University in New York, and then, most significantly, between 1961 and 1966 at Yale University in New Haven in Connecticut. Yale was then still teaching art and design according to the principles of the linchpin of the Bauhaus and emigre to the US, Josef Albers, which profoundly affected Michael then and continue to influence him today. Michael moved back to London in the mid-1960s, and the initial pieces he made bore the influence of the minimalist art he'd seen just before then in New York, albeit with a more playful approach. In 4 identical boxes with lids reversed from 1969, he took 4 wooden boxes with the same dimensions and cut through them at progressively sharper angles on the front surface. He then reversed the order of the lids on the boxes and hinged them to their bases, creating unique geometric sculptural objects. Soon he began working with found objects, but subverting their ordinariness. On the shelf from 1970 features 15 milk bottles on a metal shelf, tilting sharply down to the right. The milk bottles are filled sequentially with more water, so that the surface of the liquid in the bottles forms an elegant line. His most celebrated work of this early period contained many of the same elements. An oak tree from 1973 features a glass of water on a glass shelf, with an accompanying text that was initially in a pamphlet but is now presented as a wall text. The text is a philosophical conversation in which an artist contends that he's turned the glass of water into an oak tree, and a skeptic responds. A landmark in British conceptual art, an oak tree articulates the unique communion that occurs between artist, work and viewer. But while an oak tree was a success, its precision as a form and as a statement marked a dead end. It prompted Michael to return to first principles. He began drawing objects, much as he'd been taught when following Albers' teaching at Yale. He initially sought ready-made images, but found none were neutral enough without artistic flourishes. So he created the drawings himself with the desired impersonal character. He also determined to seek out the most ordinary of objects to depict. He had long admired Andy Warhol's idea only to depict things that were famous, from Hollywood stars to Coke and Campbell's soup. Michael's choice of items to draw depended upon them being even more familiar, more famous than famous, as he's put it, so famous you don't even notice. So he set about drawing a television, a hammer, a can opener, a light bulb, and so on. To aid the neutrality of his language, to remove any sense of an autograph mark from the images, he originally made outline drawings of them in pencil and then traced the pencil drawings in fine drawing tape onto acetate, removing his hand. From there, they would be projected. Many of his earliest drawing works feature black outlines of images on walls, like Stat from 1981, in which a television, book, cassette tape, briefcase and clipboard hover over one another, each one incongruously on the same scale, suspended and with no context. Now these images are created on a computer and enter a lexicon of forms that Michael can call on as he sees fit. As well as crisp depictions of individual objects, he's made extremely complex overlapping images, overflowing with jostling forms. These coax the viewer into Michael's world of representation, in which we're forced to shake off our natural desire for symbolism or meaning, or for conventional forms of order. There's been a natural progression of formats, from wall drawings and pieces on canvas to room-filling installations, and now, in a new work for his Royal Academy exhibition in London in 2024, an immersive digital environment called Cosmos. Part of what's made Michael's art so recognisable has been his use of colour alongside the drawings since the early 1990s. He initially chose to work only with the primaries, with the same neutral intentions. Red, yellow and blue were the building blocks of colour, sharing the object's ordinariness. But it was when he opened up his palette that Michael's creative possibilities seemed to soar. Colour, he found, could still feel ready-made with a palette of 12 colours instead of 3, but it offered an expansiveness in terms of the context for the drawings. Michael's been open to the unexpected and has developed his practice in directions he could never have anticipated. Crucial among them is the inexorable intrusion of narrative, which he's ultimately embraced. His work has become a record of time's effect on the objects, of the progression of some items from use to obsolescence. In a series of prints from 2017 called Then and Now, Michael documents shifts in the nature of objects, fusing drawings of older technologies in red and new forms in black. Heavy, boxy TVs alongside elegant plasma screens, a filing cabinet with a memory stick. One print captures another shift entirely, a cassette overlaid with a Spotify logo, the epitome of non-possession, as Michael has put it. He's also realised that art itself has become more famous than famous, and has tackled some of the greatest paintings ever made, applying the same logic in a rendering of Leonardo's The Mona Lisa or Georges Seurat's Bathers at Asnières that he does to a light bulb or a bucket. He's also applied those principles to rendering people in a series of animated lightbox portraits whose colour shifts over time. Perhaps most dramatically, he's also found a way to recreate the drawings as sculptures. By using piles driven deep into the ground, he can make them stand up, apparently effortlessly. Without a plinth, they possess an almost hologrammatic presence, monumental from some angles and immaterial from others, as they have no depth. From the side, they're simply a line. Given their modest beginnings, it's remarkable that those object drawings that Michael began in the mid-1970s have prompted over half a century such a rich and enormously complex oeuvre. To begin our conversation, I wanted to take Michael back to the moment they began, after he'd completed an oak tree and reached that cul-de-sac. Why did he decide to go back to the drawing board?
Well, what happened to me was that for several years, I had really been trying to pursue the idea of what is the most basic element of an artwork. What is the bottom line in an artwork, which is something that Duchamp had pursued, other people had pursued it. There were painters who had tried Ad Reinhardt's paintings. There's ways of trying to approach kind of ground zero. And this was of interest to, I think, to a lot of artists in the late 60s, early 70s, and it was my interest. And as soon as I did the oak tree, it was so absolute because it makes such a strong statement about what I'm proposing that there isn't a follow-up. I tried to do a follow-up, and it was a failure, which I've suppressed. And everything I did, was I going to change something else into a cherry tree? You know, it just didn't make it made no sense at all. Part of my thought about the work was it was meant to be liberating to other people, and I certainly had many young people say to me that it did act like that. It gave them a sense they could do kind of anything. And I thought, well, if I'm giving other people that permission, I should give it to myself. And that as there's no obvious way to proceed, I start again. And at the time, I also have that kind of sense of a certain kind of radicality that, of course, has always interested me. And to be honest, at that moment in the mid-70s, to make drawings of things was radical in the sense that nobody was doing it. Right. It was the most forbidden area. If you wanted an image of something, you took a photograph. It was the beginning of the period when photographs replaced painting if you wanted to make an image of something.
Right.
And so to actually go back to drawing was really forbidden territory. So to me, what's radical is only radical for a time. And if it succeeds, it's no longer radical.
Is it right that you wanted to, in a way, find drawings that were found objects? And you searched for them, in fact. You tried to find versions of the kind of drawings you had in your head, and they just didn't exist.
Yes, it absolutely astonished me because in my head, I thought I want very, very neutral drawings. I don't want to show my hand. I don't want to show anybody's hand. I just want very straightforward images of things. And then I looked at what I thought were straightforward images of things, and they were amazingly articulated with the hand of some designer or some artist who had done. The drawings I wanted didn't exist, and that's what made me do them. And I did them as neutrally as possible, so it looked like I'd found them.
Right. And you selected objects that were immediately recognisable, the most immediately recognisable object.
Yes, at the time, and for a long time, I thought of this as ordinary. I'm dealing with ordinary life, ordinary objects. What I realize now is ordinary is true, but what's actually more important is the word familiar. The audience needs to be familiar with the object in order to understand the work, whether it's a drawing, a painting, a sculpture, whatever it is. If a person needs to pause and think, what is this? Something's changed. And so my work was based on the idea that when a person came to the work, they already knew tons about it.
Right.
And that they would bring that, without even noticing, they would bring that information to the work.
And how soon did you realise that you were effectively building a library of such images?
When I started, I did think, well, I suppose I could just go on forever drawing things. One of the things that surprised me was that there were fewer things to draw than I had thought. My first batch of things started to run out faster than I thought, because then I realized that with things, there are basic things, and then there's variations. And 90% of what's in the world is a variation version of something. And I tried as much as possible to not draw the variations, but to draw the one that's the most central. I didn't draw telephones that look like rabbits. You could buy a phone but look like a rabbit. But that was not the one I drew.
Yeah. You wanted the most telephony telephone.
The most telephony
get.
telephone. Yes. I mean, the word iconic is sometimes used. It's not quite right because some of the things I don't think that it's the right word, but it is the most telephony telephone. That is correct.
And you've pushed that familiarity, haven't you, to extreme degrees so that you can, in a way, zoom in on these objects to such an extent that even just a hint of the design or a hint of the shape can tell people everything they need to know about it.
The thing that started to interest me enormously was, I see that the objects are the subject matter of my work. I see the subject matter as the enabler for an artist, but not the content. People focus enormously on the subject matter, but actually that's not usually the actual content of what an artist is doing. And the content of my work has been a kind of exploration. I don't like the word exploration because it sounds scientific, and it's not, but a play with what is visual language, what is, particularly in two dimensions, what is it to see an image of something? You see an image of a shoe. The image actually looks nothing like a shoe, and yet everybody looking at it recognizes it as shoe, and they say shoe faster than they say picture.
Right.
And that is an amazing thing. And that, as you said, we only need to see a fragment of an image, and we fill in the bit we're not being shown. When I do an image of a chair, I don't tell you what it's for, I don't tell you what it's made of, I don't tell you what size it is, I don't tell you what it looks like from the back, I don't tell you how much it cost, and yet anybody looking at it has a sense of all those things.
Right.
But they don't think about it, they just know it.
Right. And that means that it has a very, very interesting relationship with the work of Duchamp and that whole idea of the spectator completing the work.
Absolutely, which has always interested me right from the beginning when I did the first works with boxes, whereas in minimalism the objects are kind of austere and you kind of stand back from them. They engage with you physically because of their presence as objects, but you don't touch them. In my boxes, there were hinges and handles. You're meant to open and close them. You are physically participating. I've always been trying to draw the audience into a direct relationship with the art objects where it becomes overt rather than symbolic.
Right.
One of the things that had enormous impact on me was in the late 70s, there was an article by an American philosopher who wrote about picturing. And what he said was, he pointed out that picturing was something that happened in us and not in the picture. So in other words, the audience is participating in looking, it's just looking at a painting. They're not passive. They often think of themselves as passive, but actually they are making it happen.
And so is that what you were getting at when you made that work, which is little known, I think, but really important, it seems to me, called Painting and Picturing, which features a complete image in the corner of the work and then your rendering of it in the form of a drawing?
That's the kind of key work, because the things that follow that become the wall drawings, where they take the picturing out of that context and put it into a context of its own.
You've built up this library over time and then you've added objects to it. How much time do you need to spend thinking about an object that gets added, and what does it need to do?
I would like to draw a new object, at least one every single day, and I can't, because I can't find things to draw. But what happens is I'll go for a time, maybe finding one or two things, and then suddenly I realize there's a category of object I haven't really addressed. And then suddenly there's 20 objects to draw. And that, to me, those are the really big, bright moments. That's my favorite part of the work, is that sense of discovery and then of adding new works into the vocabulary of things that I have. And in the 90s, that happened really with technological objects. Because when I began in the early days, my idea of ordinary was essentially cheap, because they were accessible, because they were inexpensive. They were things that were commonplace because they weren't terribly expensive. And then I realized, a laptop, an iPhone, they cost thousands of pounds. They're very expensive. And yet, talk about familiar, they are the most ubiquitous objects in modern life. How could I not draw them, even though they had put aside one aspect of what had drawn me to the idea of drawing objects? But then that's why I go back to the question, rather than ordinary, familiar, because these things are so familiar.
I love this idea that you embrace chance in the work, because narrative arrived in your work by chance. But rather than saying, okay, I set out with this project not to involve narrative, you said, oh, hello narrative, and you welcome narrative in.
Yes, I've never had an agenda about what I was doing, even from the beginning. And I've always thought the work will lead you, and it always has. Every time I think, oh my God, I've kind of exhausted, I've done everything in this scheme of things, suddenly the work opens a little door, and I'm kind of rescued. And it's been like that. You see, because of my interest in the language of two-dimensional imagery, if you start to play within that world without an agenda, you come across narrative, you come across composition, you come across scale, you come across fragments. It inevitably unfolds these things. I'm very struck by the fact that if you go to the cave paintings, they drew exactly the same way we do. They understood, you could draw a bison that was, like a foot long. It was tiny. They didn't think it was a little bison. They knew that you could conjure the object without having to actually have one. That is the miracle of it. And of course, if we didn't have the ability to read things as images, everything about human life would be impossible.
And you're pushing it to an extreme with a new work called Cosmos. You've taken this language, this lexicon of images that you have, and now it's going to be an animated and immersive experience. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, for the exhibition at the Royal Academy, I'm going to have a gallery devoted entirely to an immersive work. It'll be on all four walls. I'm still working on this thing. I've got a couple of brilliant engineers working with me, and I'm kind of feeding them the material, which is the objects I've drawn. And because I draw the same way today as I did in 1978, I can mix images from then with images that I did yesterday, and they have the same character. So in this immersive work, there will be over 300 images drawn over the last 45 years. And then you'll have to come and see what I've done with it.
I imagine that colour will play a big role in it.
The colour is just fantastic because it's digital colour, and that gives incredible intensity, quite different than printed colour. It's brighter because the light is going through it. And I'm kind of stunned by the quality because I've been playing with technology since the early 90s. I've had computers. My work is dependent on computers. And I do very, very simple things. So I don't do anything odd, or I don't explore it in some kind of exotic way. I do the same stupid thing I did 20 years ago. I'm still doing the same thing. But the technology has improved so dramatically. I had no idea what they can actually do, and that you can have this kind of quality of image, this giant images. The accuracy of it is just incredible. And there'll be 4 projectors, but the images move seamlessly around the room. They just stitch together perfectly. I mean, I'm kind of blown away by what the technology is capable of.
Amazing. Anybody who's come across your work in the last 30 years but didn't know what came before would be stunned that you were initially quite reticent about colour. Tell us about that. Why?
There's that famous saying, who's afraid of red, yellow, and blue? And in a sense, I was. It's also true that my beginnings are in the beginnings of conceptualism in the late 60s and the early 70s, which is in many ways quite puritanical, and it's very anti-aesthetic. And so color was seen as excessively aesthetic, and so I kind of shied away from it. And in the early wall drawings, for instance, I only ever drew them in black, except occasionally I added red. Red seemed to be acceptable. That was the only color you could add to black and white that was kind of conceptually acceptable.
Something to do with Mondrian constructivism, something?
Yes, it's a kind of puritanism. Artists hate being categorized, and I never think of myself as a conceptual artist. But to the extent that you could say that about me, I've never believed that the thing that was most important in a work was the idea. You have to make the idea important by what you do, and that is what it looks like. The thing that's so wonderful about art, and to me the greatest thing, is to do something that's not interesting and make it important.
Right.
To take something that was already important and make it important, that doesn't seem like such an achievement. It's to take something uninteresting, that why should anybody be interested in this, and then force people to be interested in it because of your interest.
And so then when it comes to colour, initially you began, I think, just with the primaries, but you now have this, again, thinking about ready-made, you talked about the ready-made in terms of images, but you almost have ready-made colour.
What happened with colour was I had played occasionally, touching on colour a little bit in the 80s. I even did it earlier, but just a little kind of hesitant use of colour. And every time I'd approach it, I kind of back away. I'd do it for a while and then back away. And then I did an installation project. It was actually in the British School in Rome. And for some reason, I decided to paint the room 2 different ways. I used 3 colors. And it was because the room had a lot of character. And so much of what I'd been doing was always in a white box. And suddenly I was in a room that had clearly once been a sitting room, a bedroom. It had probably had many purposes. It was an old room. It had big marble fireplaces in it. It was like a kind of way of acknowledging that character. And that was really a revelation. The colors were not bright colors, but it was some color. And then the next thing was an exhibition in Paris, and my dealer in Paris saw the thing in Rome and said, do something like that in the gallery. And the gallery had 7 rooms. So I painted each room a different color. My sense of the ordinary meant house paint, Well, then I discovered at that point that house paint manufacturers were now making fabulous colors, really great colors. So I went and I got pure yellow, pure red, pure blue. Because what are ordinary colors? They are, again, familiar. They're the ones you can name. Blue, red, orange, pink, purple. Those were the colors I used for the room. So my vocabulary of color was exactly the same as it would be with the objects. And initially it was just the rooms, and then I did paint images on the walls using kind of naturalistic color, kind of browns and grays and beiges and things like that. Very uninteresting. And also life size. Again, cautious. And then I started to realize, this is crazy. You could make the things the same colors as the rooms, and you could make the objects any size. You can make them bigger than life, smaller than life, doesn't matter. So each thing became a kind of revelation to me. When I was a student, there was something I heard that Albers had said. Lots of Albers' drawing exercises involved trying to do something perfectly by hand. And one of them was to draw a perfect circle. If you've ever tried to draw a perfect circle with an HB pencil, it ain't easy. It is really quite a challenge. But one of the things he said was, if you're working and you find yourself, and in working, you draw a circle, in a sense, you've discovered the circle. It has been rediscovered through you because it was a revelation. And I really like that idea that things are kind of revelations.
Let's move on to the questions we ask all our guests. Who was the first artist whose work you loved?
I think that's a very difficult question. I was trying to think of what was the first artwork I saw. My parents, in the living room in the 50s when I was growing up, there was no art in the house, but there was, in the living room, a reproduction of Picasso's Blue Period painting of the girl with the bowl. Mm. And I realized years later that the actual painting was in the National Gallery in Washington, and we were living in Washington, so they must have gotten a reproduction in Washington. But it was interesting to have a Picasso in a house where there were no reproductions, there were no paintings, there was nothing like that, and it wasn't something that was talked about. It was just there. And I look at that painting now, and one of the things that's very striking to me about it is that every part of the painting is drawn with a blue outline. It's not a black line, but there's a dark outline around the girl, around everything. It's drawn very like I draw.
That's so interesting. I know that you also saw Seurat's Bathers at Asnières when you were quite young.
Yes, the painting that really struck me and that I really loved first was the Bathers. When I first saw it, I suppose I was about 10, it was in the Tate collection, because in those days things were in the Tate collection until they were considered acceptable, and then they moved to the National Gallery. And so it was moved. But I loved the painting from the minute I saw it. And there's many things that you like when you're very young, and then you feel kind of embarrassed when you get older because you think, oh my God, what terrible taste I had as a teenager. Whereas I love that painting as much today as I did. It's never wavered.
And it's never wavered in terms of your consciousness as an artist, it seems to me, that it's one of the first historic paintings that you turn to.
It was, when I thought of approaching an old master painting, a classic painting, that was the one that I first turned to. One of the things I really loved about it, there's a kind of stillness, a kind of authority in its stillness that's amazing. And it's also a picture of extreme ordinariness. This is working class people on a lunch break, basically, and they're sitting by the river and the factories in the background, and this is not gentry. And yet these people are given a kind of dignity as though they were nobility in terms of the structure of the painting. The painting has taken something ordinary and turned it into something grand. And that's stayed with me ever since.
Another wonderful element of that painting, which it seems to me relates to yours, is that Seurat drew each individual element or painted each individual element separately and then unified it into a whole.
That was something that was absolutely critical to me when I came to do my own version of it. I was very conscious of the fact that the painting is a kind of collage. And it's very interesting. I went to see the Vermeer exhibition last year, and I was talking to somebody who had been doing a lot of research on Vermeer, and they said that Vermeer's paintings are also collages, and that people think they are observations. But he said these places, as they're painted, they probably never existed. He needed to create a world in which the window is in this side, the light is coming in this way, and he takes the figures and he places them so precise, which is why those paintings have such dignity, because everything is controlled. Every single thing is controlled.
How wonderful. Other than Seurat, which historical artists do you turn to the most?
In the exhibition, there will be something that is going to be quite an important part of the exhibition. In the past 2 years, I've done more versions of old master paintings, and there will be a room that's almost devoted to those paintings. And the artist who I've done most of is Manet. I've done 3 Manets. I've done the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, I've done the Olympia, and I've done the Folie Bergère, the barmaid that's in the Courtauld. And it was very interesting. I didn't set out to do 3. I was looking for paintings that I wanted to do, and I found myself drawn to each of them separately. And then it also became very clear to me about Manet's work, because each of these paintings, in its way, is very radical. In its time, it was a very radical painting. And each one of them, part of its radicality is in how it presents women. And it's so extraordinary when you see those paintings about how his understanding of that and just how radical they were in how they addressed the question. I think they're very extraordinary paintings.
I'm bound to ask, how did you manage in transcribing the woman in the middle ground of Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, the woman behind the front 3 people, there's a woman bathing? It always seems like such a strange figure to me. How did it sit in your drawing?
I don't manipulate the image. I do it the way I draw everything. I draw a Manet the same way I draw a shoe or a laptop.
Yeah.
But it's such an odd painting because the figure you're referring to is very loosely painted, which made it extremely difficult to turn it into lines, because there are no lines, of course, in any of these paintings. But it's also very strikingly out of scale. I mean, she's much too big.
Yeah.
And so it's such an extraordinary painting. And because what I do, I'm looking at it so closely, I see every detail of these things very close up. And there's things that people go to as the thing that's really important in the painting or interesting or radical. But there's often other things in the paintings which are very extraordinary, which are not necessarily the ones that people go to immediately.
And it seems to me you've learned a tremendous amount through that process.
I found it just absolutely fascinating. Basically, to draw something is to look at it very carefully. You can't draw something without looking at it very carefully. When you do that, you kind of internalize the thing you've drawn. It becomes part of you because you're looking at it so closely. It's a form of describing it to yourself. So exactly the same thing happens with the paintings that I've done. In a sense, I feel like I know these paintings better than any art historian, than anybody else. I've been up close to them in a very special way.
There's a series of paintings you made called Common History, where it seems to me you first began to play with the idea of art as a familiar object. And in those paintings, there's this rather wonderful thing that happens that there's a pipe. Of course, it's just a pipe, but it's Magritte's pipe.
Yes.
And then there's the fountain by Duchamp. There's a urinal. And there's a really nice interplay between familiarity and art going on. And
Yes.
It seems to me that was one of those revelations that you were talking about earlier on.
Well, it was nice because after I'd been working for a time, naturally I got interested in what other artists had used common objects. And there are a few obvious ones, Magritte, Duchamp, and Jasper Johns. And so I decided to draw the things. In a sense, I saw what I was doing was making them ordinary again, that they had taken an ordinary thing and dislodged it from ordinariness by turning it into an art object. And my drawing puts it back into ordinariness. I'm not sure that's really what happens, but anyway, that was my thought.
Which contemporary artist do you most admire?
The person I've always admired, really from the beginning of my work in a very similar age to myself, is Bruce Nauman. And it's interesting because the other person I would think of is somebody like Richter. And both of them are interesting that when I began, my idea of styleless drawings, I didn't really wish to have a style at all. And I wanted to be an artist without a style. But to be honest, I couldn't do it. And it was only when I allowed myself a style that I felt like I kind of flourished.
Embracing chance again.
Yes. But when I look at the life's work of Nauman and of Richter, you see an incredible range of things that they've done. And one has to say the artist as a younger, it's Damien Hirst, who is the artist who has managed to do so many different, each one of the things that these artists do is a career for somebody else. Mm-hmm. And that's an extraordinary creative challenge. That is a really very, very special kind of achievement, where you don't try to amalgamate them all into one thing. You allow each thing to be separately itself and allow the differences, whatever the difference. You're not looking for consistency. Mm-hmm. What I found myself was, in the early work, I kept changing from one thing to another, and I found it tiring and also unfulfilling because I never felt I got better at anything. And what I've done since I started doing the drawings is I've kind of never not stopped doing it. But actually, I've done more different things by staying the same than if I had been changing all the time.
But I think the interesting thing about Nauman and Richter is that both of those artists are artists who are, in the same way that you talked about with the oak tree earlier on, it's about permission. They give other artists permission. It's like, take this and run with it. Yes. Basically. And as you say, so many artists are built on their foundation.
So many artists, so many ways in which you can look to these two people. I think it's wonderful that one is American and the other is European, and that their aesthetics, their way of dealing with things is different, but there's a commonality in that idea of addressing so many different ways of being creative.
What do you have pinned to your studio wall?
Odds and ends. I mean, I if the question is about kind of postcards of works by other artists, I don't really have that. I have photographs, mainly, some things from the family and some funny photographs that people have sent me over the years, group photographs of artists, that kind of thing. And I rarely add anything. I'm not really a person who puts things like that on the wall.
It's interesting, in the answers to that question, it seems to me that there are almost like two kinds. One is about inspiration, the other is about company. And it seems to me that in the studio, because it can be quite lonely, company in the form of a family photograph, a drawing by a child or whatever, it's a form of kind of solidarity with you as you're going about your work.
That's true. And it's interesting because I've always found it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to work with music. And so I don't. But if I'm listening to something, which I often am, I listen to Radio 4. I want to hear the human voice. Sometimes I'm very interested and I'm listening, and other times I'm really not listening, but it's reassuring that there's somebody else, that the rest of the world exists in this disembodied voice.
A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the arts and culture app. The free app offers access to more than 500 cultural organisations through a single download, with new guides being added regularly. They include an extraordinary range of guides to great Parisian landmarks to coincide with the 2024 Paris Olympics. Among them are the Notre Dame Cathedral, Sainte-Chapelle, the Panthéon and the Arc de Triomphe. Among the other guides on the app are several museums and galleries that have shown and collected Michael Craig Martin's work, from the Whitechapel Gallery and Leeds Art Gallery in the UK to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Download Bloomberg Connects and you'll see that the guide to MoMA has in-depth information on exhibitions and displays across all the floors of the museum, with audio guides to the vast array of modern masterpieces in the museum's collection, to a feature on the latest exhibition in its project series with the Brazilian artist Tadaskia. You can hear Tadaskia discuss the poetry, artist book and wall drawings that comprise the show on the app. To explore digital guides to all the partnering institutions, download the app today. It's available from the App Store and Google Play, and you can keep up to date by following Bloomberg Connects on Facebook and Instagram. Which museum or gallery do you visit the most?
Well, that's a hard one too. I mean, in a sense, inevitably one goes to the Tate, but I do feel very drawn to the National Gallery. The collection is so extraordinary, and as in any big institution, particularly I think it's one of the most wonderful thing about London, which is that the galleries being free means that you can very casually go into a gallery. I'll be going past the gallery and I go in and have a look at the Seurat, and I pass a few things and I glance at them, but basically I'm going to see something, and that's all. But then what's really amazing in the National Gallery is you go in and you suddenly discover that there's something you've never really paid attention to before, and it's just mind-blowingly good. I mean, the collection is so rich. There's hardly anything in it that's not really of extraordinary quality, and across such a range of art history. It's an amazing, special place.
One thing I don't think is widely known about you is how central you were to the whole Tate Modern project. You were there sitting on boards, talking to architects and so on. So one of the things that is often said about Tate Modern is that artists were consulted about what kind of spaces they wanted to display in and so on. And it seems to me you were quite instrumental in that process of having an artist actually integral to what happened in Bankside.
I was really very lucky because there's always 2 or 3 artists as trustees of the Tate. It was my term when I was asked to do it by Nick Sirota, right at the beginning of his time there. And at that time, there was the question of the gallery needs expanding. And so we as trustees set about a study to look at expanding the existing Tate Britain, the original building, and discovered that there were extreme limitations about how much it could be expanded. And then it was really Nick's initiative that we would actually consider another site, that there would be another building, which in itself is such a radical idea. But from my own point of view, when I was a student at Yale, and there was a course there given by one of the world's most famous architectural historians called Vincent Scully. And Vincent Scully gave a course in the history of modern architecture, starting with the late 19th century up to the present day. And his course was the most popular course in the university. There were something like 300 kids took the course every term. And he gave 2 lectures a week. He always had 2 projectors going at once. He sometimes got so excited he fell off the stage. He was a mesmerizing lecturer. And I was always interested in architecture. I'm interested in architecture in the way that artists are interested often in cinema. It doesn't mean I want to make movies. It's something visual to be interested in. I look at architecture the same way. I don't want to be an architect, but I'm really interested. And that certainly gave me an interest. So I gained a lot of knowledge about architecture through that course. It's funny in life, it became extremely useful when I was a trustee in the 90s and there was the Tate project, because suddenly all the things that I'd learned on that became useful. And so I was able to be hopefully useful. And really the idea of the design of Tate Modern, the whole project, was to create as much large, simple space as possible, as unfancy as possible, plain floors, simple thing, just creating space. And then, of course, the most amazing thing that Herzog and de Meuron did was the creation of the turbine hall. And the whole idea of sinking the ground level down so the building is taller inside than it is outside, and the bridge going across, everything about that space is magical, really. So it was an incredible privilege to be part of that, to be a trustee at that time, and to find that I had, in my own experience, something that was useful to bring to it.
Which cultural experience changed the way you see the world?
Having said that my parents didn't have any particular visible interest in art, when I was 14, my father, his work took him to live in Bogota, in Colombia. So we lived in Bogota for a year. And my parents met a young Spanish artist, he was in his 30s, called Antonio Rhoda. And he was a terribly nice person and a real artist. I mean, not a kind of Sunday painter. He was a real artist in the sense that we would understand a real artist. And I immediately started to take drawing lessons with him. So the whole time I was in Colombia, I was going several times a week for drawing classes with him. He was teaching in the university as well. And I was already, even by the time I was 14, I was already interested in the idea of being an artist. But it was something very special to see you could be an artist. Here is a person who is an artist. When does an ordinary kid get to meet somebody who's an artist? You don't often do that, and certainly not at that time. And so it was amazing to me to meet this person and to see how he lived, how he worked, and that gave me the idea this is something that's doable.
Did you turn back? I mean, was there any doubt in your mind from that point that you wanted to be an artist?
I toyed with all sorts of things. I'm articulate, but I don't have the same fascination with literature and the written word as I am with the image and the visual. If I have any strengths at all, that's definitely where they are. So I like the idea of being a playwright. Also, because of my Irish heritage, I realized when I was a teenager looking for identity, I looked to Ireland. And to look to Ireland was to look at literature. I didn't know anything about Irish artists. I didn't even know there were any Irish artists. But as far as literature was concerned, you know, you've got Swift, and then you've got Joyce, and then Beckett. And really, Beckett became terribly important to me, terribly important. I really wanted to be Beckett.
That's really interesting. And you've already answered the next question. But it's really interesting you mentioned Beckett, because it seems to me, is it possible that the spareness in your work relates, and then that deadpanness, but somehow a poetry in your work relates to Beckett?
I love that you say that because I would love that. I also think I learned something important, and you see the same thing in Duchamp, is the use of humour in dealing with very serious questions. That very serious questions can be addressed using ordinary language, you can use ordinary human feelings, and you can use amusement. I mean, the oak tree text is written to be as amusing as possible. It's talking about something very serious, but it uses the seduction of humour.
That text, actually, I think is beautifully written. So when you said you didn't have much facility for literature or whatever you said, it seems to me that that was somebody who knew how to write that wrote that. I've always thought when I looked at it, that must have taken a lot of thought.
I have a vague memory of writing it. I had the idea of the change, and then I thought, but I can't just say this is an oak tree, because that sounds like I'm just changing the name. And first of all, that's already been done. And secondly, that isn't really what I mean at all. And then I realized that the only way I would have to write something more extensive. And I didn't like the idea of having to write anything. I would prefer it to have none, but I thought we have to. And then I struck on the idea of a discourse, that it could be a dialogue. And as soon as I thought about the dialogue, I really just sat down and wrote it. And when I finished writing it, I knew I'd done something special. I knew that I had hit on something very special.
Have you ever observed the way people interact with that work? Because I think it's fascinating. Because it is this sort of to and fro that happens, looking between the work and the text, and, you know, between the glass of water on the shelf, this spare thing. And you can see a philosophical process happening with the viewer.
Well, that in the interview, the text, which is, it's like an interview, it's a discourse, it's Q&A. And what I wanted was that, in a sense, I'm saying I'm the artist and the other person, the skeptic, is the viewer. But when you read it, you get to be both. And in a sense, we're all both. And so the viewer is also the artist, the viewer is the believer, the viewer is the skeptic. You get to play the whole gamut. And just by reading it, you're playing both parts.
What other media influence your work?
I don't do any social media. It's the one thing I've always kind of tried to engage with everything contemporary so as to be as much as possible as part of the contemporary world. I've always had a very strong sense that, which I've probably overdone, but that as soon as I'm interested in something, I get too interested. And so, to be honest, I never learned to cook because I thought if I learned to cook, I'd spend too much time thinking about cooking. So I don't know how to cook. And if I had another life, I'd love to spend a life entirely devoted to listening to music. I don't really do that because I don't have time to do that. I haven't given as much time to music as I would have liked to, but I've been very single-minded about what I do. And my feeling about social media is, one of the things I do know about it is that it's very time-consumingly absorbing, and I don't want to become involved in a distraction.
There was a film of yours that emerged relatively recently. I think your family found it, that you thought lost.
Yes.
Was there ever a moment where you were toying with the idea of being a filmmaker?
It is quite extraordinary what happened. When I was at Yale as an undergraduate, there were lots of people who came and visited the school. And there were poets and artists and writers and filmmakers. And there was a filmmaker called Robert Flaherty who made a film called Man of Arran. And it's beautiful, black and white film, again in Ireland. So for my kind of degree project, I proposed doing a film. And at Yale at the time, there was no film department. No one had ever made a film. And that's very funny because I didn't even have a camera, like a still camera, let alone a film camera. I went and I found a secondhand Bolex camera, and I bought the Bolex camera. And I got a light meter and an instruction book with the Bolex and a tripod. And then I went to try and find if there were any books on it. And the only book, is so funny, this is like 1960, 61. I go to the Yale Library, it's a fabulous library. The only book on filmmaking is Eisenstein.
How amazing.
So the only book I read on filmmaking was Eisenstein. And Eisenstein's idea about filmmaking, his genius was in the juxtaposition of images. So that's all I went with. That was my full kit. And then I went to an obscure part of the Irish coast, which was very beautiful, in a sense, very bland in Connemara. It's not dramatic in a kind of Swiss Alps sort of way. And I saw it as kind of low-key. At the time, there were still people leaving the land. So there were deserted houses. There were hardly any people. Extremely beautiful. Now it's a tourist area, of course, like everything else. And I knew at the time, if it had the Mediterranean climate, you would have had that. But now you have it anyway, even without the Mediterranean climate. So I made the film there. But the thing that stopped me was the realization that, first of all, I get to the camera and I think, how long do you hold the button? What is a shot? How long is a
Right.
shot? How long is a shot? I don't know. So I think I made up a thing like 1 minute or 40 seconds or something like that. And every single shot was exactly the same length because I couldn't think of what else to do. I never knew if the light meter worked because I'd never used a light meter. I didn't know if the camera worked because I'd never used it. Then when I got back, then I had to wait 2 months for the film to be processed. And then the film came, and then I spent a lot of the year editing. But I couldn't cope with the delay. And that put me off the whole idea of filmmaking. Of course, today, it wouldn't be the case. Today, you would have it digitally, and you'd be able to see instantly what you had done. But at the time, it took months before you knew. I didn't know if it was all going to come out blank. I had no idea. And I thought, I can't take this. It's too much stress.
That's wonderful. Is there a particular discipline in your daily working life that you see as an essential ritual?
Well, the way I work now, really for many years, is I do nearly everything on the computer. My work demands extensive planning because once you're physically making something, it's hard to change. And I'm talking about paintings. I mean, if I'm making sculptures, I make a drawing, I send it to the art fabricator who makes, I don't make the sculptures in the studio. If I'm doing printmaking, I work with printmakers, they have their studios, the work is done out of the studio. The thing that's done in the studio is painting. And I do all the drawing and the painting. I always draw on the canvas, on everything. There's never been a thing I've done that I haven't done. But I don't do all the painting. I do have one assistant. I never have had more than one assistant. But by the time we get to the physical thing of making the painting, I've done 20, 30 studies on the computer. I do the drawing on the computer. I fill in the colors in the computer. We know exactly what we're trying to do before it starts. It is possible to make some color changes, which I sometimes feel the need to do once it's painted. I can do that. But the drawing can't change. So I've got to get the drawing right because you can't move the lines once they're there. They're etched into the paint, and that's it. So planning is everything to me. But it's the planning that the computer has allowed that has enabled me to take whole museums and do giant images filling gallery after gallery. It had to be planned meticulously because the second you're there, you don't have time to just do anything except do it. And so it's been an incredible enabler. I could never have done the work that I've done over the last 30 years without the computer. It would have been absolutely impossible.
If you could live with just one work of art, what would it be?
Well, I suppose it would be Seurat. There are some other incredible works. A couple of Vermeers would be nice to have. And a Manet. I'd happily take the Manet out of the Courtauld and bring it home.
That sounds like a good choice between Seurat and Manet. And lastly, what is art for?
Art to me it's got a metaphor for life. It's not a mirror. It doesn't present a mirror to life. It's a way of looking at what human experience it is. What is the world? How do we perceive it? I think the question of perception is very important. There's ways in which we think about the world, and there's ways we feel about the world. Art's about how we perceive the world, and that's a bit different than either of the other two. And it's the place where we allow a degree of speculation. So much of the modern world seems to want to close down the freedoms of artistic play. And to me, if art is not play, it's not anything. And art is so much to do with the pleasure of life. To be an artist is to make a life with the pleasure of what you do. And you don't have to be an artist to be happy in what you do. But that is the key for everybody. That is the creative key. If you're happy in what you're doing, you're a happy person.
Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you.
A major exhibition of Michael Craig Martin's work is at the Royal Academy of Arts in London from the 21st of September to the 10th of December. Michael Craig Martin, an anthology, Prints and Multiples, 1996 to 2024, is at the Christea Roberts Gallery in London from the 25th of October to the 23rd of November. And that's it for this episode. Please subscribe to A Brush With wherever you're listening, and do give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Do also subscribe to our sister podcast, The Week in Art, a deep dive into the latest big art world stories, the top shows and the key issues. That's back in September. And please subscribe to The Art Newspaper at theartnewspaper.com. We're on X at Tan Audio and on Facebook, Instagram and Threads. Production, editing and sound design on A Brush With are by David Clack, and the producer is Lewis Jebb. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway, and a big thank you to Michael Craig Martin. Thanks for listening. Bye for now. A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects. Download Bloomberg Connects today and discover cultural institutions on demand.